Welcome everyone. My name is John Spear. I'm Executive Director of the Australian Workplace Innovation and Social Research Centre here at the University of Adelaide. And it's my great pleasure on behalf of WISER and the Dunstan Foundation, who are the co-hosts of this very, very timely and important event, the Age of Disentitlement, Household Impacts of the Federal Budget. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Kaurna people here. I'd like to thank very much the organisers of today's event, my colleagues at WISER and colleagues at the Dunstan Foundation, Olivia, Ben, Donna and John. Thank you very much, and Mark, for all your efforts today. We're very privileged today to have with us Professor Peter Whiteford. He's the Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, Canberra. Between 2008 and 2012, he worked at the Social Policy Research Centre, and I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the volume of work that Peter generated when he was there. He previously worked as Principal Administrator in the Directorate of Employment, Labour and Social Affairs at the OECD, and he's undertaken extensive work advising governments throughout the OECD, Europe, China and Eastern Europe. Peter was one of the first, with his colleague Daniel Nethery, to release a piece of very important work just after the federal budget that helped us understand what some of the household impacts were of the federal budget. And it certainly captured my attention at the time. I was very grateful at that very early stage to see that work. So thanks, Peter. That was a very important contribution to understanding what were some of the critical distributional impacts of the federal budget. Since then, we've all had a bit more time to reflect on the impact of the federal budget, and some of you may be aware that in recent days a major report's been released by WISER, commissioned by the Premier's Task Force on the impact of the budget on South Australia. And on your seats you will find a two-page summary of that report, and the report itself is downloadable off the WISER site and also off the Premier's site. As we meet here today, the Premier is in Canberra at the Council of Australian Governments meeting, and he'll be presenting that important report to that COAG meeting and to government ministers as well as senators to try and deepen understanding of what are some critical distributional impacts associated with the federal budget on South Australia. More than 265,000 households here in South Australia are significantly adversely affected by some of the income support measures and pension changes in the federal budget. You'll find some of the detail in that two-pager. I'd strongly encourage you to have a look at that and inform yourself about some of the household impacts as well as some of the spatial impacts of the federal budget, themes which Peter will pick up and enhance on today. We have a distinguished panel joining us in a little while to respond to Peter's talk, including Ross Womersley from SACOSS, Dr. Alice Clark, Executive Director of Shelter SA, and Simon Schrapel, Chief Executive Officer of Uniting Communities. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Peter Whiteford. Could you please welcome Peter?
Thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks, John. Thank you very much to WISER and the Dunstan Foundation for the opportunity to come to Adelaide and talk about this. So I'm going to talk about the impacts on households, and in particular, it'll mainly be the impact of the changes to social security benefits and taxation. To start off with, I want to talk about very briefly about the concept of the age of entitlement, then about how different ways of measuring the budget impacts. I'm then going to briefly explain why cutting social security benefits in Australia actually increases inequality more than any other OECD country. And then talk about some of the defences of the budget that people have, particularly the Treasurer, and a range of other groups have put forward since the rather negative response to the budget. So I think the title that John came up with about the age of disentitlement, of course, refers back to the Treasurer's speech when he was Shadow Treasurer in 2012 about the age of entitlement. But there's the rhetoric of some of this has preceded the current government. And say, for example, Julia Gillard, when she was Prime Minister, made reference to we've moved beyond the days of big government and big welfare. It doesn't quite have the same overtones as ending the age of entitlement. The Treasurer's speech was to the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, which is in the UK, very influential think tank. It was one of the first think tanks followed, I think, from the 1960s onwards, that basically promulgated the ideas of Hayek and the need to roll back the welfare state. The Treasurer didn't, in that speech, but when he was Shadow Treasurer, didn't actually refer all that much to Australia. He was talking more about European welfare states. But he said that the idea that well, I suppose it's the idea that people are entitled to social security payments, that this needed to be rolled back. Some of the language that he's used, particularly in, there was a major defence that he gave in June after the very negative reaction to the budget. He gave a speech at the Sydney Institute. Also echoed some of the language that was actually in the budget speech when it was delivered, which was that this dichotomy between lifters and leaners. In fact, I think the language of lifters and leaners actually goes back to Menzies, who first referred to it, but I'm not sure he meant exactly the same thing as appears to be coming out now. Now, so I'll move on to measuring budget impacts. Now, there are various ways of measuring them. The most obvious way is common sense. It's you just have to look at the budget and think, if you make people ineligible for unemployment benefits under the age of 30 for the first 6 months, what sort of impacts that's going to have. So most of this is based on common sense. And I think the fact that, particularly in the social security sphere, that the most negative impacts are on low-income groups is pretty obvious as soon as you look at the details. One of the things that also I think where it's very obvious, and I'll show some of this, is that when you look at where the savings fall, so you look at how much revenue is how much expenditure is saved out of different groups. I'll talk briefly about what are called cameos, which is what my colleague Daniel Nethery and I calculated. Cameos are sort of hypothetical families. So you take a lone parent on benefits with a child of 8, or a lone parent who's in low-paid work with a couple of children, or a high-paid person who's affected by the deficit levy, and so on. The work that NatSem in particular is associated with, both in the most recent paper earlier this week and also in their modelling of budget impacts, is called microsimulation. Basically, that's the same sort of thing. You take calculations, you use Excel spreadsheets to calculate what's the change in disposable income for different households, but with microsimulation you attach this to an income survey so you can generalise it up to the whole population. So it's the same sort of calculation. We each did somewhat different things, but I think it's fair to say that the main thrust of our results is very similar. We didn't include, say for example, in our calculations at the ANU, the impact of the ending of the school kids bonus, because it wasn't actually part of the budget, it was something the government had announced earlier. But so the scope of what you include is quite important. We deliberately adopted a very conservative approach to estimating the impacts. But just to talk about the distribution of revenue, in his speech to the Sydney Institute, the Treasurer pointed out that social security and welfare accounts for about 35% of the budget. Now, this is not health, it's just social security and welfare services. So at 35% of the budget, if you're going to cut spending, you're likely to have a big impact on social security. However, when you look at where the spending cuts come, about 52% of the spending cuts are in programs administered by what's now the Department of Social Services. So while 35% of the spending comes from that department, sort of, more than half. So there's a disproportion between the impact. Now, if you actually look at, drill down further, family payments, that's family tax benefit Part A and Part B, while they're a big component, they're only about 5% of the total federal budget. They provide 35% of the savings, so 7 times as much. If you look at family tax benefit Part B, it provides just over 1% of federal government spending across the whole, sort of across everything, including defence and public service, etc. But it provides about 10% of the savings. But the most disproportionate impact is the proposals to raise, to extend, make people receive youth allowance until the age of 25, and then also the 6-month waiting period if you're under the age of 30 on the unemployed. Now, my rough calculation is, people get very excited about spending on the unemployed. Spending on the unemployed is about 2.5% of the federal budget each year. It'll go up if unemployment goes up, obviously, but it's about 2.5% now. Under 40% of people who receive New Start or Youth Allowance are under the age of 30. So what that means is that less than 1% of the total federal budget is spent on unemployed people under the age of 30. They provide nearly 10% of the budget cuts. So they get 1% of the spending and provide 10% of the budget cuts. So you can clearly see that this is disproportionate to the share of the spending that they receive. Now, one of the things you might, rather dubiously argue is that it could be that we're overgenerous to families, or that we're overgenerous to the young unemployed. And anybody who works with youth who are unemployed knows that that's not true. When you look at the level of benefits that the unemployed in general get in Australia, relative to previous wages, for the short-term unemployed, we have the lowest replacement rates in the OECD. So relative to their previous wages, we actually have the lowest in the OECD. So the idea that we're generous to the unemployed and that therefore they could afford to be cut back seems rather dubious, to say the least. As I said, what we did, we were able to do it fairly quickly because it's sort of as a quick and dirty type calculation. You take these hypothetical families, you feed in, what are the proposed changes to their social security payments, you feed in what's going to happen in the tax system. And 2 things in terms of the income tax system are happening. There's the proposed, well, in fact, it's going to happen, deficit levy on high income earners for 2 years, but there's also fiscal drag. So every year, if people's incomes increase, they move, more of their income moves over the tax thresholds and they'll pay higher taxes. Now this has been going on for a long period of time, obviously. We don't index the tax scales, so some of the money that will repair the budget deficit is actually due to this fiscal drag. When we looked at it, we noticed that for basically since about 2005, previous governments, it started off when Peter Costello was Treasurer and continued under the Labor government, they made calculations each budget of how families, hypothetical families, would be affected by the budget. So they call these cameos. There was an appendix in the budget papers, the budget overview every year that presented these results. Now, one of the things that gave us a great advantage of it is that my PhD student, Daniel Nethery, used to work in the Treasury, and he actually worked on these cameos about 4 or 5 years ago, so he knew what was going on. So we did these calculations. Now, this year, that table was absent from the budget papers. I don't think this was particularly sinister. What it was that for most of the period since 2005, the Australian economy up to 2008 was doing incredibly well. People got tax cuts, there were increases in family payments. We were indexing some payments to wages. So everybody was moving ahead. After 2008, that wasn't the case, but the stimulus package meant that, you know, sort of there were gains to families across the distribution. So that for most of the previous 7 or 8 years, it was just that governments could show improvements in people's disposable incomes as a result of the budget. Whereas this is the first year where it's really difficult to do that. So as I said, we basically replicated the past methodology, helped by the fact that Daniel had done it already and knew what he was doing. And what we found was, you know, confirmation of common sense, as I said. Now, most people are negatively affected to differing extents. Basically, to not be negatively affected by the budget, you would have to be a person without children who doesn't drive a car and never goes and sees a doctor, right? So it's a sort of a, you know, most people are negatively affected to varying extents. But the really big impacts, as illustrated by the fact that, you know, sort of 45% of the spending cuts come out of families and the unemployed, that these are the groups who had the biggest impact. So if you were a 23, now we didn't take account of the Medicare changes, we didn't take account of the fuel excise tax indexation. It's quite complicated how you measure the time period by which you calculate these things, but we deliberately, as I said, adopted a very conservative approach. Now, what you find is that, and I should emphasise, we also didn't take account of the 6-month waiting period. So our calculation is just based on the change to moving people from youth allowance to New Start. So basically, because, you know, it's very hard to say what a typical, you know, period of unemployment is for a young person under 30, because it varies enormously. So we had a really conservative approach to estimating it. So an unemployed 23-year-old, just by the change from moving from New Start to youth allowance, would lose close to 18% of their disposable income. An alone parent with an 8-year-old child, because of the loss of family tax benefit Part B, would lose more than $50 a week, or 12% of their disposable income. We express this all in current terms. But people in low-paid work would also lose. And one of the things about family tax benefit Part B, which it's got a lot of critics in terms of the idea that it's a disincentive to work, but mostly it's targeted on low-income families with children, primarily because a lot of them are lone parents, but also the ones who aren't lone parents are single-earner families. So they tend to be lower household incomes than high-income families, than two-earner families. The temporary tax, the temporary deficit levy, for somebody on $250,000, they'd lose about 1% of their disposable income. And of course, they'd lose about 1% of disposable income for 2 years, whereas the benefit changes, if they'd been introduced, would have been permanent. So that's what we did. As I said, NatSem, you know, basically made the same sorts of calculations, but you can then generalise it up to the total population, because you can say how many single parents there are on benefits, how many there are in low-paid work, how many there are couples with children there are in low-paid work, and so on. So you take the same calculations, but you generalise it up to the total population. Now, what they calculated is that if you took the poorest 20% of households, now what you do when you do these calculations is you adjust for household size. So if you have children, you need more money than if you don't have children, or if you're a couple, you need more. You're treated as if you need more money to have the same living standards than a single person. So basically, the savings that they included, and again, I don't think they included all of the budget savings, meant that, you know, if you were in the poorest 20% of households, they would have about $2.9 billion taken out of their incomes over 4 years. If you were in the richest 20% of households, it'd be about $1.8 billion. So less money. Now, the other thing is that the rich have more money than the poor. So in fact, after taxes and benefits, the average income of the richest 20% is more than 5 times as much as the poorest 20%. So losing more money obviously has a big impact. So the poorest 20% in their calculation they have about 8% of the income of the total income at the moment, but they'd contribute 16% of the savings. So a ratio of about 2 to 1 in terms of who pays for the savings. Now, what I want to talk about now is how this fits in with the sort of longer term philosophy, so to speak, of the Australian social security system. Now, this is not quite a quote, but the OECD itself, after I left, in a different part, has written a working paper that shows that cutting social security in Australia increases inequality more than any other OECD country. That's if you just cut social security across the board. Now, cutting social security, as we all know, hurts the poor. So this is from recent OECD figures. These figures are actually quoted by the Treasurer to defend the budget, which shows what proportion of income the poorest 20% get from social security in different countries. So what this says is that at one hand, in Denmark, the poorest 20% get nearly 90% of their income from benefits. At the other extreme in Turkey, because they don't have much of a social security system, they get less than 20% of their income. Now Australia is about the fifth ranked of this. The poorest 20% get nearly 70% of their income from social security benefits. That's, yeah, a lot of that's age pensions, because in terms of income, our age pension is further down the income scale than a lot of countries. But so social security is the major source of income of low-income people, which is what you'd expect. At the other extreme, if you say, how much do the richest 20% get from social security, you can see we're on the left-hand side. In Australia, the richest 20% get about 1% of their total income from social security. Now, the reason for that is that we income test more payments than anywhere else. The only place that's particularly like us is New Zealand. The United Kingdom is a bit similar as well, but they have a few more non-income tested payments. So when you cut social security, by definition, you don't impact on the poor, on the rich very much. And that's why cutting social security increases inequality more. Now, the other illustration of this is to just say how targeted is our social security system to the poor. And this is a calculation that says what's the actual amount of money we pay to the poorest 20% compared to the amount of money we pay to the richest 20%. Now, this is in Australia, as you can see, which is on the far right-hand side. We pay, in absolute terms, more than 12 times as much to the poorest 20% as we do to the richest 20%, because we target the poor. And we've always done this. I mean, when you do this over time, Australia's in this position since you were able to make these calculations in the early 1980s. You know, as I said, New Zealand's a bit like us, but there's a big difference between us and New Zealand, and then it's Denmark, interestingly enough, and the United Kingdom. So because we target the poor more than any other country, cutting social security impacts on the poor more than any other country. Now, what are the defences of the budget that have come forward? Now, I think the most comprehensive defence of the budget is the speech that the Treasurer gave to the Sydney Institute in June 2014. This is when he argued that the budget, criticisms of the budget are sort of motivated by class warfare. He then made a number of statements of fact, saying that payments are too broadly available to too many people. As a result, less is available to those most in need. He said that, and he quoted the figures I put forward, showed you, that Australians in the lowest 20% have the highest reliance on government of any country in the world, which is not the fact. We've got the fifth highest. We're up there with the Scandinavian countries, but we're not the highest. So these particular statements are not entirely accurate, but they're also have a curious interpretation of what we're doing. I mean, the reason why poor people in Australia get more out of the social security system than the rich people is that's the way we've designed the system. We've income tested it. You know, this is just the system doing what it was intended to do. But then he raised the question of, you know, sort of who pays the taxes that the people on benefits receive? So he said, is it fair that the average working Australian, be they a cleaner, a plumber or a teacher, is working over a month each year to pay for the welfare of another Australian? And he then pointed out some statistics about 10% of the population, this is from the tax statistics, pay about 2/3 of all income tax, and more than just 2% of taxpayers pay a quarter of all income tax. So he said, would these people regard the system as fair? And I'll come to some of that discussion later. But then he said, in striving to achieve equality, it is not the role of government to use the tax and welfare systems as a tool to level the playing field. Well, that's a pretty curious thing for a treasurer to say. We've had a progressive income tax since 1915. We've had income-tested social security benefits since 1909. Income testing social security benefits and a progressive tax system is about levelling the playing field. I mean, that's what they're designed to do, right? So, so I find that statement curious, shall we say. But if you put together what he said with what other people, editorials in the Financial Review, the Institute of Public Affairs, various columnists in other news organisations, they've argued that a number of things, that our welfare system is unsustainable, that it should be better targeted. The Treasurer said all income groups, including the poor, have done extremely well in the last 20 years, so it's sort of like we can cut back because they've been doing well. The other argument that I think that's particularly interesting is the argument that it's not their income. Now, when I first read this, I thought, well, every statistical agency in the world defines social security benefits as income, right? And of course, that's what entitlements mean. People are legally entitled to this under the current laws. So, from a sort of a purely objective position, when I first read people saying it's not their income, I sort of thought, what does that mean? But then I realised what they mean is this idea that the money is transferred from somebody else to the poor. The other argument that's been put both before the budget and subsequently is that actually our system's unfair to the rich. So they're the only people who pay net taxes. And the other argument I've heard in Canberra is that, well, we have to reach a balanced budget and there's no alternative to this. And you also get that in some of the business reactions, I think, to the criticism of the budget. So is welfare sustainable? Well, if you look at what public social spending is, this is the most recent estimate for 2013, where this is social security, community services, this is at all levels of government, not just federal government, and public health care. It doesn't include education. This is the percentage of GDP. We spend a bit under 20% of GDP. We're about the 9th lowest in the OECD. Now, if you go back to the, sort of these sorts of figures, you can get back to 1980. You can get back slightly earlier. Our spending on social security, health and welfare has gone from about 10% of GDP to 19% of GDP. So over a 30-year period, it has nearly doubled. About 2/3, a bit less than 2/3 of that spending is on age pensions and on healthcare. The amount of spending that's on the unemployed of this, because this is social security spending, is about 6% of the total spending. It varies depending on the unemployment level, of course. So we've had an increase, but basically we're well below the average for other rich countries. The main reason being that we spend very little on age pensions compared to other countries. We spend about 60% of the OECD average, and age pensions is a very big item in most places, including Australia. So we said bend below the average, but it's roughly doubled over a 30-year period. Now, one of the other debates, particularly that's been put up in some of the background to the McClure Review, but also the McClure Review shows a chart very similar to this. This is the percentage of the working age population receiving social security benefits. This comes from the Department of Social Services, so this doesn't include family payments, this is just social security benefits. And what they do is they record at 30 June every year the number of people who are getting a payment, and you then can calculate this relative to the number of people aged between 16 and 65. Now what you see is there was back in the mid-70s, about 10% of the population of working age were receiving a social security benefit. That went up in the early 1990s as a result of the recession of the 1990s to about 25%. But since 96, 97, it went down fairly steadily. There was a blip at the end at the time of the global financial crisis, but after that, it started to reverse itself again. Now, as you can see from the fact that there's these big jumps, the big jumps are in recessions. So there was a big jump in the early 80s recession, there was a big jump in the early 90s recession. There was nowhere near as big a jump in the 2008 global financial crisis, 2009. We're basically at the level of receipt of social security amongst people of working age that we were in the early 1980s, before the recession, or just after that recession started. Now, if you went back to the 1960s, about less than 5% of the working age population were receiving social security benefits. But in the 1960s, unemployment was about 2.5%, and the average duration of unemployment was about 6 weeks. And also in the 1960s, the employment rates of women were significantly lower than they are now. Not that that's an explanation of the growth, but what it means is the world of the 1960s is not the world we are living in currently. So, you know, in terms of working age income support, we're close to the lowest level that we've been in most of the last 20 years. When you look at, say, rather than looking at the numbers of people who are getting a payment at a particular period of time, the proportion of households who get more than half of their income from benefits in a year, but then you look at their ages, because this only goes from 96 up to 2011-12. In many respects, the broad picture is consistent. What you get is that in terms of households, back in the mid-90s, about 21% of working age households got more than half of their income from social security. It's about 14% now. It was lower than that in 2008, before the global financial crisis, but it's gone up and then started to go down. But one of the really striking things is that the biggest decrease is amongst people aged 55 to 64. So it's gone down amongst all age groups, but it's particularly gone down amongst older people in the pre-retirement period. And that's both a consequence of many of reforms that were basically introduced by the Labor government in the mid-90s, particularly raising the pension age for women and reducing the assumption of dependency of women on men in the social security system. So, but you know, what you get is about 14% of working age households over the course of a year get more than half of their income from social security. Now, as I mentioned, one of the arguments the Treasurer put forward is that all income groups in Australia have done very well over the past 20 years. Now, if you look at the change in income, this is adjusted for inflation, it's for the household, it's after taxes and benefits, and it's adjusted for household size, which is what equivalised mean. This is the increase in the levels of disposable income of households at different points. So P10 is a household that's 10% of the population are poorer than them. So they're towards the bottom of the distribution. P90 is 10% of households are better off than them. So they're high income, they're low income. Now what you can see is that in real terms, we've had big increases in incomes. These are probably the biggest increases, consistent increases in incomes that Australians have enjoyed since the gold rush. They're incredibly unusual. The only country where the median household did better than in Australia in this period was Ireland, and that was up to 2008. They haven't done so well since. The richest 10% of households in Australia had the highest increases in their incomes of any rich country. Now, what you get is that the poorest 10% are about 48% better off in real terms, but the richest 10% are more than 60% better off in real terms. So on the surface, at least superficially, this supports the Treasurer's arguments. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Now, you know, people here know, you know, effectively, if you're on Newstart, and they're not the same people on Newstart now as they were in the mid-1990s, Newstart hasn't been increased in real terms. It's indexed to inflation, right? So how can people on Newstart have had a 50% increase in their real incomes? Well, they haven't. What's happened is people on benefits have been slipping down the income distribution. And so if you're a single person who get your income from Newstart, back in the mid-90s, you got your payment was about 47% of the median income, the middle income in the middle, whereas now it's 31%. So it's sort of, it didn't fall for quite a long period of time, mainly because median incomes didn't increase so rapidly, but it's now at 31% and falling. So even though every income group, you know, when you look at the overall figure is better off, in fact, people move up and down the income scale. And I'll talk about that. I'm conscious I've got about 3 minutes, haven't I? Right. I mean, the argument that it's not their income is, I think, probably one of the more interesting concepts and one that is worthy discussing. I mean, basically, it's what it's saying is that it's us and them. You know, there are those of us who pay the taxes, and there are those of us who get the benefits. And it's also saying that this is a sort of a permanent situation, that the people at the bottom of the income distribution are always there, and the people at the top of the income distribution are always there. Well, strange to relate, that's not correct. Now, I'll move forward very quickly. Basically, what you get, as I said, is that what we have to look at is not just what happens at a point in time, but what happens over time. Now, fortunately in Australia for the last 12 years or so, we've had a wonderful longitudinal survey conducted by the University of Melbourne, which has followed the same households over a period, well, since 2001. Now, when I saw these figures in their publication, I rang up Roger Wilkins, who's the person who produces the numbers, and said, "Is this correct?" And he said, "Yeah, we were surprised by it too." Now, as I said, you know, at a point in time, about 15% of households, over a year, about 15% of households get more than half of their income from Social Security. When you look at what happens over a 9 or 10-year period, 2/3 of working age households in Australia have contained somebody who received an income support payment. Not a family payment, not age pension, an income support payment at some time in a 10-year period. So most people, most households are affected by the Social Security system. Now, if you say, what proportion of people get virtually all of their income, 90% or more, from Social Security for all of that 9 years, it's 1.2%. Now, what we often think of in terms of welfare receipt is that people are on welfare for extremely long periods of time, and some of them are, but it's a tiny minority. If you do this for young people, so if you say, if somebody was under the age of 25 at the start of this survey, 80% of people who are under 25 received a Social Security benefit at some stage in that decade. But the people who stayed on Social Security benefits for all of that decade is 0.3 of 1% if they started off at that age. So basically, people move in and out of the Social Security system. Now, the reason for that is if an insurance salesman comes to you and tries to sell you an insurance policy, you should think seriously about it. Basically, lots of bad things happen to people, right? People become unemployed, their family relationships break up, but most significantly, they become sick or injured, or somebody in their immediate family becomes sick or injured. So something like over a 4-year period, 45% of the population will either experience a serious illness or injury themselves, or somebody in their immediate family will. So basically, people move in and out of the welfare system because of these adverse events, but also because of the life course. So one of the arguments, and I'll stop here, is that one of the arguments about what we do is, while we target the poor more than anybody else, we also provide insurance against risks, and we also redistribute across the life course. Half the people receiving social security benefits in Australia are over the age of 65. You know, in current terms, they're leaners, right? But they're leaners who have paid taxes, most of them, for all of their lives. So basically, you know, the idea that you can dichotomise the population into lifters and leaners, in the UK they refer to strivers and skivers, and in the US to makers and takers. So it's a very similar sort of, they go for rhyming rather than alliteration, but anyway, that's something to bear in mind. But, you know, sort of the social security system impacts on all of us and provides insurance across our lives. And I'll stop there. Thank you.